and welcome to the Mediatwits number 176. I'm Mark Glazer, executive editor and publisher of MediaShift. Today we'll be talking about social media and the presidential election in the U.S. How are things different this year than previous social media elections? The cycle seems to be faster. We have Donald Trump live tweeting debates. How are things different, and are they better or worse? We'll be talking about that on this week's episode of the Mediatwits. But first, a word from our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. Indeed, I am at NextSpace right now in Potrero Hill in San Francisco. I want to introduce our panel on this week's show. We have Hadass Gold joining us from Politico, Josh Stewart from Sunlight Foundation, Megan McCarty at KPCC, and our producer, Jefferson Yen in Los Angeles. So this, we're all kind of immersed in politics, and it seems like it's always been kind of a 24-hour news cycle, but maybe it's even more hyperspeed than ever with everything that takes place on social media, not only the typical platforms like Twitter, Facebook, but now there's Snapchat and Instagram, and it seems like a new social platform to follow kind of every week. Plus, with all the outsider candidates doing well, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, using digital, using email, using direct appeals and social to really build a following that didn't really seem possible in the past. Hadass, what do you think is different in this cycle as far as social media, digital, how things are versus previous campaigns?
I think in the previous campaigns we definitely saw the use of social media, but I don't think we saw it as heavy as we're seeing it now, especially by the candidates themselves. And I think that the person you really need to look at this for is Donald Trump, to see really how he's affected the race through his use of Twitter and Instagram. He's even said this himself. He said, I don't need the newspapers, I don't need the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, I have Twitter. And he goes and he responds to everybody, and every single time he tweets, almost every single time it turns into a news story. We saw how his feud with Fox News and Megyn Kelly really blew up over Twitter. And he actually uses Instagram as a platform for his advertisements. He hasn't actually paid for any advertisements on traditional media because he knows that anytime he puts anything online, a video or a tweet or anything like that, he'll get earned free media out of it. The news outlets such as Politico or the TV networks will all replay that video or link to it or something like that, and then he didn't have to spend a dime on advertisement.
And do you think that's a good thing? That we've talked about this a lot, about the disintermediation going on with media, where candidates and celebrities and everyone really has a chance to kind of go directly to the public. Where does that leave you, and where does that leave the political media?
I still think to an extent there are digital gatekeepers when it comes to social media, and this is something that's actually been studied in a lot of media studies and in universities, that Donald Trump definitely has a wide reach. He has a lot of followers, but he doesn't have nearly as wide of a reach without the traditional media, because we're the ones who pick it up and turn around and show it to other people. Not every single person in the world is on Twitter or on Facebook, although a lot of them are, and not all of them are checking it all the time, so they might miss it. However, a lot of people are still tuning into CNN, a lot of people are still hopefully going to Politico.com and reading about it, and that's where they're finding out about it, is from the media. Actually, a lot of our stories about Donald Trump, about his Twitter rants, are often our most read story.
Yeah, and so do you agree with what Nicholas Carr was saying on Politico about social media is kind of ruining politics? I mean, it seems like in a way it's opening it up too. I mean, the discourse is different, but there's a lot more people contributing.
I don't think it's ruining politics. It's definitely changing it, and it's changing the way political journalism is conducted. I think it's making it a lot faster. It's no longer where even a few years ago you just get an email statement from somebody. Often the statement comes first on Twitter because it's faster for somebody to release a statement on Twitter than it is to email all thousands of the journalists that they're trying to reach.
Yeah. And so, Josh, at Sunlight Foundation, you guys have done some amazing work when it comes to transparency and kind of following the money when it comes to politics.
Yeah.
And really looking at, you've been doing a lot of work around data, and everyone talks about big data and how important data is in politics. I mean, is this year even more so when it comes to data?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and like in some ways we're sort of standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, which sort of the folks who opened up the data in the first place. We obviously have a long ways to go with opening up more data, but for instance, we're focused on sort of this cycle is real-time, sort of across different avenues. For instance, we have a real-time influence explorer that allows folks to dig through campaign finance data, which is incredibly valuable in terms of who's spending what and sort of when that is happening. Some of it is reported, thanks to sort of Hadass and her colleagues at Politico and folks elsewhere, but some of it is not. And so that's sort of our roles, helping to comb through a lot of that big data, as you say, in order to sort of help journalists, help advocates sort of tell stories and make sure we're holding these folks accountable. I mean, following the money is still, it's an old trick, but now that we have all these sort of tools which Sunlight participates in, it can be very helpful for sort of making sure 2016 is accountable. I mean, this is going to be an unprecedented year for money in politics. So, sadly.
No question. It's like billions of dollars. But what about the Party Time blog that you keep too? You also do this thing where you kind of follow who's going to be at what, political events and who's funding all those events. I mean, that's pretty good stuff too.
Yeah, so we sort of it's great. So we sort of have a suite. We talk about the real time, but we also have Party Time, which is sort of reporters, lobbyists, fundraisers, advocates, everyday citizens sort of can anonymously submit invites to our Party Time tool, and that allows us to gather not comprehensive, but sort of the biggest database of publicly available and publicly searchable fundraisers, right? And from there you can sort of, it ranges the interest from the interest story of what it takes to fundraise and the amount that folks have to fundraise in order to be a successful elected official, all the way to the end is like, are there trends here? Like, where is the money being raised? What are we like to call them ATM states, where folks go to California, but are they necessarily asking for votes? Are they just asking for money? So you can find a lot of different trends there. And sort of real quick before I pass it off, we have a third tool called Ad Sleuth, which sort of combs FCC data and political advertising. And so the way those three connect, sort of, again, like I said, in real time, I think can be a helpful tool for, again, journalists and citizens alike in terms of tracking the money, how it's spent, and how it's raised, sort of like every step of the way. So.
Yeah, and on the campaign sides themselves, I mean, they're also using a whole lot of data when it comes to figuring out who to target, if they are doing advertising, unlike Trump, where to put their ads, how has that changed when it comes to data within the campaigns themselves?
I don't know if I can speak, maybe one of the reporters can speak more specifically about how campaigns sort of are using their data, but I mean, we are seeing folks use things in unprecedented ways. I think somebody mentioned Bernie Sanders. There was some good reporting by Natalie Andrews where she talked about their use of Reddit to sort of galvanize hundreds of thousands of supporters and sort of help raise. I believe in the last quarter was about 24 million. I forget what he raised this quarter. But in terms of how they're utilizing big data internally, that's something like we don't monitor that closely. I would sort of defer to maybe some of the reporters who may have some good insight on that.
Yeah. And Megan, tell us a little bit about your campaign at KPCC. You really were looking at more on the local side, and all politics is local to some extent, but you had created this kind of Make Al Care campaign through social media. And tell us a little bit about that and what the effects were.
Sure. So we wanted to, unlike the presidential election, create a conversation around an election where there wasn't a lot of conversation. It was a local election. It ended up having only 9% voter turnout for a municipal election in Los Angeles. So rather than cover, a particular issue or a particular, city council race, we decided to focus on one voter in this race where we knew not many people were going to turn out, try to make that person vote through the power of social media. Chose that one voter, kind of started a Twitter campaign, hashtag #MakeAlKhair, and we really didn't know how it was going to turn out. We were pretty impressed with the amount of, our audience members that started tweeting at Al and tweeting, using the hashtag. I think the hashtag was used about 1,000 times over 2 weeks, so it wasn't like gangbusters, but for a local election that saw 9% turnout, we were pretty impressed with it. And, the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, made a video for Al. The candidates started making videos for Al. And it kind of started driving real life engagement as well. A lot of the candidates, were tweeting at Al and using the hashtag and then going by his restaurant. And so it did kind of shrink down what was even, already a local election into an even smaller microcosm, something that you would think, old-time electioneering, people going, stopping by his restaurant, and that's what really made the difference.
So
he did go vote.
On one person, I guess. How do you kind of translate that to get more people to vote? I mean, what are you thinking about doing next?
I think next we'd like to. It was a really elegant, story structure to have one person to focus on. Of course, we'd like to expand it, maybe do a city block or, a street or an apartment complex or something. But the thing that I think was interesting about focusing on one person, in this kind of an election where there is such low voter turnout, there were 14 candidates in this city council race, and there's a very definite, even in all elections, there's a definite kind of calculus that they do in terms of who's going to turn out and whose concerns they need to speak to during the election. And so by having Al as the center of attention, a non-white renter in a race where usually, wealthy white homeowners are the only people they need to talk to, it kind of magnified the voices of a lot of people who are not usually spoken to in those elections because they don't necessarily turn out to vote. So, at candidate forums and things, they were having to answer questions that they don't normally have to answer about affordability and, renters' concerns or walkability and public transportation. So we were pleased that it did at least kind of expand the scope of what the election was about, even just by focusing on one person.
Yeah, and there is a frustration when you talk about 9% of the people voting. It's amazing how low the turnout is when it comes to elections in the U.S., and especially these local races. Do you think, you're a local, public radio station? What is the kind of responsibility of the media in getting people out to vote? You can only do so much, but do you think there's more media could do?
Right. That was kind of an interesting debate that, we started having as we were planning this coverage because, we do sort of have this traditional kind of media idea that we shouldn't be, advocating for something, even if that something is just public engagement. How far should we take it? I was printing out voter guide materials and giving them to Al, driving him to, candidate forums, and I was getting a lot of feedback from people who wanted me to do more. There came a point where we realized that Al was registered at the wrong address, and he was actually going to have to file a provisional ballot, and people were like, why didn't you check ahead of time and make sure he was registered before the date? And, so we definitely came down feeling like, okay, well, maybe that might have been going too far, because it was very instructive to learn that, as a renter, he changed addresses a lot. This is an issue that probably a lot of renters have, and so it became part of the story. But we became very comfortable with the idea that, we are going to advocate for public engagement. That's part of our mission. Public radio has a little bit of a different role, I think, than some other media outlets, and we're very much part of the community. We have community events. We ask our community to pay us money, several times a year. So we have this kind of ongoing conversation with our audience, and I think we felt like it felt right to be to be a bit more engaged and to be to be advocating for something, even if that something was just to have our community be more engaged and to have that be part of our mission. And I have a colleague at WNYC. They did a somewhat similar project for one of their local elections in New York, and it was just an interesting thing. It came out about at the same time as Make Al Khair, where they actually basically did a get out the vote campaign and went door to door knocking, did robocalls with Brian Lehrer, and so yeah, it's an interesting line to cross. It feels comfortable for us now, but yeah.
No, that's great. And Hadass, do you think that there's an issue with people being engaged? I mean, this seems like maybe people are more engaged than ever because there's a reality TV star involved and on the national level. But it is hard on the local level to get interest for people. I mean, that seems like a long time problem here.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really fascinating to see on election day what the turnout is for this election. We have seen so far a lot of engagement in terms of, I guess you might be able to call it passive engagement. Ratings for the debates, for example, have been just absolutely bonkers. Nothing beyond anybody's expectations. They are the highest non-sports rated cable events that anybody has seen so far, and I think that a lot of that has to be credited to Donald Trump. People might lament his part in the election, but he has done one thing, which is really bring the campaign to everybody's mind who might not have otherwise even realized that the campaign was happening yet, because we're so far out. Now, there's the question of, by the time we get to the general election, whether or not Trump is in that race, will there still be that level of engagement? I would argue that people are more interested now. We have two marquee names, Trump and Clinton, and actually three if you include Jeb Bush as well, who are in this election, and they have such high name recognition amongst the general public that whenever people hear their names or read their names, they're more likely to pay attention versus some of these other candidates who people know a little bit less about. So I definitely think that voter engagement and voter turnout is obviously still a big issue, and that's always something that politicians and civic people are trying to increase voter participation. But I think this election in particular, we've seen a lot of, at least, like I said, passive engagement. People are at least paying attention, perhaps more than they would have in previous campaign cycles, at least this far out.
Yeah, and the big question is that going to translate on a local level? If you're paying attention to national debates and Trump, does that mean you will? I mean, if you're going to obviously go to the ballot to vote, maybe. And then maybe you'll have to vote for local issues, so maybe you'll pay attention more to it. But I guess that's still an open question.
Right. I mean, that's always the challenge, which is always ironic because arguably local elections affect your day-to-day life a lot more than who you elect to be president, which I think a lot of people don't realize. But unless Donald Trump was running for city council or somebody like him, then fewer people are likely going to be paying attention, and I think that also has to do with us in the media. How much resources do we have dedicated to covering different things? We've seen a lot of resources recently dedicated to covering the 2016 race. Even outlets that you might not expect to be covering politics or the campaign this early on, such as sites like Business Insider or even Mashable, have dedicated politics teams, but only to national politics, not really paying attention to local politics as much. Some organizations, I'd argue Politico is one of them. Politico is dedicated, I think, by 2020 to have a presence in every single state, which will include things like our playbooks, which are granted very insidery, but hopefully that will help engage more people in local politics.
Yeah, and what do you think about the organizing that's going on by the national elections when it comes to social and digital and outreach? I mean, that's been growing. Obama was a real breakthrough candidate when it comes to small donations, and it looks like Bernie Sanders, might even do better than him.
Right. I mean, you can definitely see some campaigns and candidates are more comfortable and more nimble on social media than others. Like you said, Bernie Sanders is very adept at raising money online. Donald Trump is obviously very good at engaging with people online. I think all of the candidates are clearly showing a lot of, are giving social media and giving, just online presence in general a lot of attention, as they should. It's pretty obvious who is much more natural online and much more comfortable with being online than others, and who is much more calculated. Calculated doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just, I think people can, it's strange to say this, but I feel like people can tell authenticity online even. They can see who's actually tweeting themselves. And it's, for example, I hate to go back to Donald Trump all the time. It's very obvious that he is tweeting himself, or that everything is coming straight out of his mouth, and it's not going through 30 different communications professionals before it goes online.
Yeah, and so there's more authenticity, and that's what people will relate with. Josh, you wanted to jump in about the kind of small donations and what they mean at this point.
Yeah, just to build on the idea of like, how do we know folks are engaged, and that is always a tough thing, but just from things that we look at and things we track, I think small donors and sort of the number of donors and how many small contributions and those sort of metrics can be good barometers for how engaged the electorate is. So if you see candidates on either side of the aisle touting 500, 600,000, a million small donations, I think that is really a good barometer for how many folks are committing to a candidate early on and then repeatedly supporting them. And I do think you'll see those sort of talking points ramp up, and then we'll be able to sort of back that up as we sort of look at their data, and reporters as well look at their data. But that's going to be sort of a huge thing absent sort of the vote itself, and then sort of good polling, which we've seen some good polling so far in the race, but the donors is really like, especially in a caucus or a primary, that's a real test of it, sort of grassroots excitement. So.
Right, and people talk a lot about the dark money, the money that you can't track, through the nonprofits and all that. How do you deal with that? I mean, does that mean more digging? Is there a way to figure it out?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it does take more digging, and sometimes you can't do the digging when it matters most, right, which is during the election. So for those who don't know, dark money is money that can be donated to a 501c4 nonprofit. They can use they're supposed to only be able to use about half of their money for sort of political activity, right? And the big problem there is they do not have to disclose their donors. And if they do, we don't know until they file their forms with the IRS much later, right? So a great example is the Center for Responsive Politics just issued a report on this 501c4 called Carolina Rising, who spent about $5 million in the 2014 North Carolina Senate race. It was to support now Senator Tom Tillis, and they spent about 97% of their funds on for or against that around that Senate race, which according to IRS rules is not allowed, right? But no, we don't know that until after the fact. So just many ways down the line, there's problems with dark money, and basically the inability, to track that. Super PACs, which are sort of these large independent expenditure organizations, say what you will about them, but we at least can see those donors, right? And we can hold them accountable in some way. Dark money groups are sort of right now sort of the worst offenders when it comes to transparency and money in politics. And unfortunately, we're seeing those being utilized. A couple of presidential candidates already have these sort of dark money groups aligned with them and are spending money in Iowa and New Hampshire already. So something we'll be watching very closely, and just hoping for some sort of breadcrumb where we can follow that money there. So.
Yeah, and the New York Times did an amazing report, looking at kind of the 150 families in the U.S. that have kind of given the most money to all the different campaigns, and that was pretty incredible. I want to also turn to the Pew Research that looked at kind of how people are engaging on social media when it comes to politics, that, only 46% of people will post on Facebook or on social media about politics, yet they're more willing, 86% are more willing to talk about those in person with people. Megan, I know you don't typically cover politics, but you obviously are on social media, and do you think that's accurate? Do you think that there's kind of there's certain people you see on Facebook who are going to give their views, and there's other people who just are going to avoid it at all costs?
Sure, people like my dad just post all day about politics on social media, but in terms of some of the issues that might not be, front of mind for people, or, I think I think because there is this sense that there are trolls and there is this polarization that happens on social media with politics. I think there are a lot of sensible people who probably don't want to engage in those kinds of discussions on social media because I think they spiral out of control sometimes. But yeah, what was interesting about our project was, we were able to access a lot of people who weren't having those conversations on social media, and to create a conversation on social media that wasn't necessarily about the politics or the candidates specifically, but more, kind of a conversation about the election and social engagement and that kind of thing. But when I went out canvassing to find Al, to try to ask people, if they would want to take part in our project, and so engaged a lot of people in real life over, the issue of the local election, and probably educated a lot of people. I hung out in Trader Joe's parking lots and laundromats trying to ask people. I hung a sign around my neck saying, "Hey, don't pay attention to local elections. Tell me about it. I'm a reporter." So yeah, I think probably a lot of people talked to me under those circumstances about politics, and probably at least, got some wheels turning in terms of at least knowing that there was an election happening that would definitely not have been engaged on social media with those issues.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're just about a year away from the national elections, and so this is still kind of early, although it feels like it's been going on for a while, but we'll definitely be coming back to this topic again and see how things play out in the primaries and also in the national election. I want to thank our guests, Hadass Gold from Politico, Josh Stewart from Sunlight Foundation, Megan McCarty from KPCC, and our producer Jefferson Yen in LA. You can catch us each and every week on the Mediatwits at mediashift.org. You can follow us on Twitter at the Mediatwits. Our past episodes are on SoundCloud and YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, please review us on iTunes. Catch you next week.